Hey folks, Matt Easton here, Scholar Gladiatoria and Eastern Antique Arms, and I want to talk about an aspect of British military swords, antique swords from the 19th century. I'll talk about that in a second. So this is what we're looking at here, is a British, in this case, light cavalry officer's sword. Now, actually, there's two things to say about this sword. One is the purpose of this video, and the other is an aside. I'll just start with the aside. It won't be long, don't worry. But this is, as you can see, it's an 1821 pattern, as it's known, 3-bar, 1, 2, 3. Actually, historically, these were often known as 2-bar, just to confuse matters, but we generally call it a 3-bar. 3-bar hilt, as found on light cavalry officers' swords, and in fact light cavalry swords up until 1864, but on their on the cavalry officers' swords right the way through until 1896. In 1896 they got replaced with a different type of hilt. I won't go into that here. But this sword is an example of an officer who basically went, "Nah, I do whatever I want." And he basically ordered, in the time of George V, so we're talking about World War I here, this has got George V, the GRI cipher on the blade. So this dates to after 1910, if I remember correctly. George V came to the throne, and he's still ordering a 3-bar light cavalry officer's sword like you would have found in the 19th century, and it's quite interesting. So this is marked specifically to the I don't think you'll be able to see on the camera, but to the 31st Lancers, okay, and they were essentially from an Indian cavalry regiment, and this is very typical of British military swords, that we find if a sword is unusual or weird or just out of the ordinary in some kind of way, it's very often associated with Indian regiments. In other words, Indian Army rather than British Army. Of course, India was part of the British Empire then, the British Raj, but nevertheless there was still a degree of separation between Indian Army and British Army, and of course they permanently separated after Indian independence. But the point is that this, in the time of the First World War, he was still ordering a 3-bar hilt, and you know, it was in 1912 a completely new model of sword came in with a thrusting blade and a bowl hilt. So this is kind of like two patterns out of date, but nevertheless this officer obviously knew what they wanted, and they ordered it. And this will be on my website for sale. It's going on into stock. It's been service sharpened, I would imagine, either for Northwest Frontier policing duties, essentially. So this regiment, the 31st, didn't actually, they weren't really on active service in World War I, although they may still have sharpened their swords for World War I, as British Army regiments generally did. But they were involved in the war in Afghanistan in 1919, so just after the First World War. So this is either service sharpened for just general duties on the Northwest Frontier, or perhaps for the 1919 Afghan War. But that aside, there is a specific feature of this sword which, if you knew nothing else about it, would help you to date it. And this is not dealt with in any of the, as far as I'm aware, any of the books on antique swords which some of you might have on your bookshelves. But it is absolutely categorically, as proven in the articles on my website, and my website linked below, a fact. And that is that this backstrap, okay, seems a fairly minimal and innocuous thing. This backstrap changed in 1895. Okay, so regardless of whether the sword is an 1896 cavalry officer's sword, or an 1895 infantry officer's sword, or an 1897 infantry officer's sword, or whatever, okay, or 1912 is a bit different because it has a completely different type of grip, but if it has a backstrap on it, then this backstrap changed in 1895. And what you often find is, for example, rifles or guards officers' swords. So the rifles officers' guard actually was a patent of 1827. So it's often referred to as an 1827 pattern. But what you find is that after 1895, the backstraps on them change. Okay, they change from the older, smoother very often slightly curved type with just at most a checkered thumb placer, to on this version, if I put it near the camera and get it to focus on it rather than me, you can see it's fully checkered up here and it's squared here. So the two ways to recognise the 1895 backstrap are the fact that it's quite straight all the way along here. I have had one example which was slightly curved, but generally speaking they're very, very straight here. They're fully checkered all the way up, so checkering. The checkering of course gives greater friction and gives a more secure grip. And this section where the thumb goes is made rectangular and completely flat, kind of square, so it's a much more secure placer for the thumb. So, if you're looking at a sword and you think, oh, that's a rifle sword, and you see that it's got this type of backstrap, then almost certainly it dates to after 1895. And the same goes with if you take Royal Artillery officers' swords. So Royal Artillery officers' swords look very much like this, and they're often referred to, more or less correctly, as the 1821 pattern. However, they're still in use, but they're not really the 1821 pattern. They are, if we break it down, an 1845 pattern blade. There's an article on my website about this model of blade. That means it's fullered, single-edged, double-edged for the last about 10 inches. So it's an 1845 pattern blade, an 1821 pattern guard, and an 1895 pattern backstrap. And there is a certain style of grip as seen here which tends to go hand in hand with the backstrap, but the grips can vary. So with the grips you can't really use that as a dating point. So when we talk about a pattern of sword, when you hear someone refer to an 1821 pattern Royal Artillery officer's sword, for example, or light cavalry officer's sword, it doesn't mean that that model of sword has remained unchanged from 1821. It just means that people are using the patent date of one part of that sword, a distinguishing feature, in this case the guard, to name that sword, to kind of approximately describe what type of sword it is they're talking about. Okay, but as mentioned, this is actually an 1845 pattern blade. They were pipe backed before that, an 1821 pattern guard, and an 1895 pattern backstrap. I hope that's been somewhat useful to you, and I will see you for the next video. Cheers folks! Thanks for watching. Please subscribe. We have extra videos on Patreon and you can follow us on Facebook.